This one will be slightly more mature than my usual videos, and based on the topics I'll be discussing and some of the visuals, I expect this to be heavily stepped on by the algorithm. That's never stopped me before, but for your viewing purposes, you have been warned. If you know anything about the Western comic book and art landscape, you've undoubtedly heard the name Frank Frazetta. Frank was born in the Big Apple in 1928, and he created a lot of really imaginative art before his sunset in 2010. Many consider him to be the godfather of fantasy art, which you could just Google the term and his name will be the first to pop up. Looking through his work, you'll notice certain themes feature prominently over and over, some of which I'll talk about, but there are more than enough videos, articles, and publications that you can find discussing his life and his work, so I'll skip that portion of his history and I'll jump straight to the topic of this video. Fire and Ice is an animated film from 1983, before my existence was even so much as contemplated, and it was directed by Ralph Bakshi in close collaboration with Frank Frazetta. More on Ralph later when we get to the weird sections. If you know of him, you can probably already guess what those sections are, but they don't relate to the 1978 Lord of the Rings animated movie. Just FYI. This film was my first real introduction to adult fantasy, and I was probably around 10 when I saw it. My mind was much more sanitized at the time, so I didn't even realize how mature it actually was. Today, many parents are keen on what their children are consuming, but back then, because you could literally count the number of cartoons that existed and just TV shows in general, it was assumed that all cartoons were child-friendly and approved for all ages. The movie aired on one of our local TV stations, and that's where I saw it for the first and only time. Until yesterday. I was looking up the conversations about it online, and a lot of people seem to have watched it under the same circumstances as I did. But just on that note of the lack of awareness around mature cartoons, we have a lot of them today, but back in the 90s, everyone just assumed that animation was for kids. I mean, one of the local stations aired South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut back then, and parents let their kids watch it because, it was a cartoon. But once they figured it out, the backlash was swift and vicious. So the plot of Fire and Ice is really simple. A witch gave birth to a son who she raised and tutored in the black arts and the powers of the mind. Narrator's words, not mine. But I don't think she was referring to Susie or Mohammed. In her evil plot to conquer the known world, she assembled an army and used her son named Necron to expand their ice kingdom and crush all who opposed their conquest. Typical villain stuff. The sun controlled a glacier that was sent rumbling southwards towards a mountain region called the Fire Keep. The glacier was clearly taking its toll on Necron, and he was doubtful that he could reach the Fire Keep. Necron's mother decided to take a different route towards their conquest. She sent her envoys to go and threaten and blackmail the Fire King, and while they were discussing terms in the king's throne room, a group of savages were also sent to the daughter's quarters to kidnap her. The princess, as you will come to see, was the original Instagram model in every way. Before the Kardashians, before BBLs, there was Princess Tigra. Okay, so there's no getting around this, so I might as well address it now. The subhuman savages are depicted as darker in complexion and less evolved than the main protagonists and antagonists of the film. And Twitter just erupted. But just looking at Frank's work in general, he was enamored with Eurocentric standards of beauty. His drawings featured mostly muscular white men, beautiful but scantily clad white women, big cats, and grotesque creatures, which are all common staples in the fantasy genre. Some corners of the internet have accused him of racist depictions of other cultures, like this piece called Desperation, that features a white man seemingly rescuing a white woman from a group of African warriors, or probably savages in the context of this scene. This accusation reminds me of the controversy with Hergé's Tintin books, but in a slightly different way. And before I continue, this is my own speculation, just to be clear. While Hergé's depictions of African and Asian cultures were born of ignorance, but apparently evolved with more information, I think Frank's depictions were somewhat akin to properties like Indiana Jones. They are the Western lens through which other more quote-unquote exotic cultures are viewed. They're playgrounds for the white action hero to come against obstacles and triumph over them, and the more stereotypical they appear to be within the foreign culture, the more exotic they'll be perceived as. Frank had a piece called The Winter Coup, which is also called Indian and Cowboy, which demonstrated an interest in Native American culture, which is something that could be felt through the Fire and Ice movie. He also has other depictions of African kids fighting a dinosaur and seemingly appearing as the protagonists in the piece. He later found fascination in the Maasai warriors, who are known to hunt and kill lions with spears, so he started to depict Maasai warriors in his work as well. I know you're all waiting for me to get to the point regarding the savages of darker complexion in the movie, but I wanted to establish all that so that I could say, it's my suspicion that Frank borrowed aspects of other cultures and used them in the design of his fictional characters. The savages actually appeared in his old black and white comics, but at the time, they were as white as the heroes were. This seems to have been a choice they made when coloring the movie and imbuing it with aspects of Native American culture. The darker characters are not all negative though, because a prominent character in Frank's art who is also featured in this movie called the Dark Wolf is of a much darker complexion and shares stereotypical Native American traits. He's in many ways wiser and more capable than the blonde protagonist. He could actually be viewed as the real hero of the film, while the blonde was just there for the girl. So there is that. There is also a grotesque mindless creature who appears later in the film, and he shares a similar complexion to the white characters. He's also a minion to a white witch, which makes me think that they were characters modeled after different points of fascination for Frank. I'm not taking any side in the accusation, I'm just sharing a bit of nuance from my perspective, having seen a lot of Frank's work. But I also think the inclination or trope of having the evil character with darker features has been a trend longer than I've been alive. Whether it's Scar from The Lion King, look at this phony guy trying to act so concerned, or whether it's any of the other Disney villains cast in shadow with weird skin tones, darker colors are just used as shorthand for evil with a lot of storytellers. You may call it stereotypical, prejudicial, or lazy, but it is what it is. But back to the movie and the final controversy that I'll touch on. The consensus of the time of release, again, before I was born, was that the princess was overly sexualized in the film. Now this is the aspect that actually shocked me during my rewatch yesterday. I picked up on none of this when I first saw this film, and I'm quite shocked that TV in the 90s aired this without any form of censorship, which was common back then. The censorship, I mean. I first watched Police Academy on TV as a wholesome family comedy, and only when I watched the DVDs much later did I realize how much nudity was in those films. And some of it could have been because Ralph Bakshi, who I mentioned earlier, had developed a reputation at this point. He had another animated movie called Fritz the Cat that had its own accusations of racism and unnecessary sexualization of characters. While it's definitely gratuitous, you can't argue against that. Anyone who has seen Frank's art will agree that it's on brand for a movie about his characters. So back to the plot of the movie. Princess Tigra and the blonde protagonist who is introduced at the start of the movie become the vehicles through which the audience navigates this dangerous and fantastical world. Princess Tigra would escape and get captured from time to time, but they gave her a level of drive and cunning which saw her try to escape her captors every time. She wasn't just sitting back and waiting to be saved. There is danger everywhere, and as much as the story rushes from one event to the next, they cover a lot of the tropes of fantasy adventure on their quest to defeat Necron. They have shallow water monsters, deep water monsters, vicious dark woven creatures, and subhuman savages at every turn. But the part that horrified me as a kid was when Princess Tigra's pompous and arrogant brother went to Necron to bring an end to his evil conquest. If you thought the concept of blood bending started in Avatar, you are mistaken. Necron did something that was evil beyond my wildest 10-year-old imagination. He puppeteered Tigra's brother and his men into taking each other out, and that scene haunted me for days. I had never witnessed such evil in my young innocent life. But this video was not really going to be a play-by-play of the movie, because there is not too much in the way of plot. Just several action-packed moments and beautiful, fluid, rotoscoped animation, like I referenced in my Max Fleischer's Superman video. There were many logical fallacies in the movie, but realism is not really the point in fantasy. If you're a fan of the genre, there is still a lot you can take from the film in spite of such a thin plot and weak characterization.
Is he certain? It was my son you saw.
They called him Prince Taro.
He died.
But the movie is trim and efficient. It gets to the point as quickly as possible without any bloat. Just straight up violence and beautiful visuals. So I usually conclude all these by saying this could never be made today. But in 2014, there were reports that Robert Rodriguez was making a live-action adaptation of this film with Sony. The film was never made and the trail went cold. But I would be curious how they would approach this film today if they're still working on making it a reality. Have you watched Fire and Ice? Let me know your thoughts on the potential live-action adaptation and any and all things I've discussed in this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace. you.